Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University, and today I have the great pleasure to be with Mark Koyama and Jared Rubin. Mark is Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University, and he's a Senior Scholar at the Mercator Center. Jared is Professor of Economics as well at Chapman University, and he's the co-director of the Institute for the Study of Religion, Economics, and Society. And they are the authors of a recently published book by Polity Press called How the World Became Rich, The Historical Origins of Economic Growth. We're going to be talking today with them about the book and their careers. Let me say hi to them. Hi, Mark. Hi, Jared.
Yeah. Hi, Javier.
Thanks for being here. Let me start asking you guys a bit about your life and your career. Um, Tell me, how did you end up writing this book? And if you can, let's start from the very beginning. Where are you guys from? How did you decide to study economics? How did you end up being interested in economic history? Let me probably start with Jared.
Sure. All right. Well, yeah. Thanks for having us on. It's a really nice podcast, and yeah, we're really grateful you're having us. I guess my journey started in undergraduate when I took my first economics course. I was planning on being a math major, which I was, and it just so turned out that that's the right combination to get into an a good economics graduate department as being a math and economics double major. I also had an interest in religion from an early age, but not really out of personal conviction. Partly because I'm not religious, I think, in large part because I'm not religious, and I don't. But yet, I fully realize the obvious that religion has a massive influence on the way people act and interact with others. It's something I want to understand better. So I took a lot of religion courses, and then I went into economics grad school thinking that religion would be something I did on the side. And I stumbled into a class with the man who would eventually become my advisor, Avner Greif, and he has done quite a bit of work in this space, but kind of at the intersection of history, economic history, religion, culture, and it kind of blew my mind that this was something economists could do. So there were massive strokes of luck along the way in terms of getting to the point I am where I'm doing research that I find interesting and that I love. It was, I went to grad school not thinking I could do this type of stuff. But for my journey, at least to that point, that was how I got there. And then I'll let Mark talk a little bit about how we got together on this book. Mark and I have known each other for a very long time now. We actually did our dissertation separately. I was at Stanford, he was at Oxford, but we both did it on a large part of our dissertations were on usury restrictions in the medieval period. Not exactly a thriving topic, but the fact that two people were doing it around the same time, we obviously, it was like kind of obvious at some point we would be chatting. We attend a lot of the same events, and eventually just stayed in touch. And we had a conversation a number of years ago now, probably 6-7 years ago, at an event, probably an Economic History Association meeting, where we talked about the idea for this book, that there was nothing really out there. And I know we'll get into what the book's about, but it really is a text that's meant to cover the big theories in how the world became rich. There's been a ton of work that's been done on this in the last couple decades, and prior to as well. But there's been nothing that's really kind of put this together in one kind of digestible, readable place. And it's the type of thing that I think not only professional economists, academic economists will be interested in, because not everyone is up to date on this literature, but we try to write it in a way that non-academics, particularly undergraduates, but also just people that are generally interested in this type of academic writing would be able to see what the state of the art is in this literature. And we were discussing this. We realized there's nothing out there that is widely accessible to people, especially outside of the academy. And so we just kind of pushed back, talked back and forth, and eventually realized we should do something about this. And so that's where this book came about. Yeah, we certainly both have we've both contributed to this literature. From my own style, I'll let Mark talk about his own work, but from my own standpoint, I wrote a book on the role that religion, particularly Christianity and Islam, have played in the long run economic developments of Western Europe and the Middle East. And again, that was something that was part of this path that you asked about at the beginning. And that's only a small part of this book. Both Mark and myself, we don't favor our own favorite explanations in this book. What we're trying to do is bring them all together, and really also, in the part that I think is original to this book, the first half of the book, as we'll talk about, ends up being just a review mainly of all the various theories. We organize them and put them together, but of the various theories out there. But then the second half is really thinking about how they interact with each other, and that's where some of our own work comes in, some not. So I think that's probably a long-winded answer to your question. So I'll hand it off to Mark now.
That is great, Mark. What about your story, Mike?
Great, yeah. So I studied both modern history and economics at Oxford. So I've always been very passionate about history. I was like, history nerd, like many kids are. Into the Middle Ages, Roman history, a lot of political history, a lot of military history, and I did history at Oxford, and when I was as well as economics, and I guess before I started that program, I assumed that the two disciplines were entirely separate. But you do history, you do economics. But I didn't quite realize there was a subject called economic history, which was the intersection of the two. And actually, a large component of that modern history and economics course is economic history. And so I actually didn't initially love it that much, although I was very lucky because I was exposed to a lot of really good lectures and tutorials. Bob Allen, who's now Abu Dhabi, he was a professor at Oxford at the time, and I think he was teaching the undergraduates even. So we had tutorials from Bob Allen and Jane Humphreys and a lot of leading economic historians. So I got exposed to quite early on at quite a high level the topic of economic history, and then when I went on to graduate school, I actually didn't initially want to study economic history. I was more interested in studying. Well, interested is a strong word, but I thought it was good for my career to study economics, basically. And so I started the MPhil at Oxford with idea that maybe I wouldn't stay and do the PhD. Maybe I'd leave after 2 years and get a job in economic consulting or some central bank stuff, those types of jobs which are available if you do the MPhil at Oxford. But I ended up liking academic life a little bit too much. And staying on and completing a PhD. And at that point was when I really discovered some of the work that Jared was talking about, the kind of institutional analysis. So particularly Douglas North, Avner Greif, and that type of institutional work. And after a lot of playing around with other topics and realizing that I wasn't that interested or well suited to doing work on say, macro economics, I decided to go back to and really focus on economic history, but particularly from an institutional angle. So actually, unlike, I guess, at Stanford, there wasn't a lot of institutional economics at Oxford. There was, very much traditional cleometric economic history. So Nick Harney was my advisor, and he's done seminal work on data, on collecting data and various series of prices and costs and wages from Industrial Revolution England. So that was kind of where I was starting my studies. But I was drawn to this institutional work, and that's what I've mostly pursued in my career going forward, really at the intersection of economics and history. And I think that's an area of research which has really flourished, and a lot of people are now involved in it. So it's a much bigger area of research than it was 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I think. And the book, Jared has told the story somewhat of how we came to write or came to have the idea of writing the book. But the book really is designed to be a one course, if you're taking a one course on world economic history, global economic history, or indeed, if you're doing a development economics course, but you want to understand like how we got to where we are, this is a book which is only 200 pages, but it's really going to summarize um, what we've learned, particularly what we've learned in the past 20 years. There are a lot of older books which cover a lot of the historical background and which are really good, but they don't take us up. They don't take a student or early stage researcher or someone who's just on the margins of it, not deep in this field. How do they get to the frontier? How do they understand how these how all this work fits together? How does it relate to each other? That's what our book is doing, and I think it's I hope it's going to find its audience because I think it's somewhat unique there, and it really covers a lot of top research papers from the past 20 years, but it does so in a way that puts them in historical context. It's not about just using the past to test economic theories. It's about really using economics to understand the past, particularly the history of growth, the development and evolution of the modern world economy.
Right. Let's talk then about that. Let's talk about the book. So I had a great time reading it. I teach a course here called Wealth of Nations. So it's basically a course on economic growth that has an emphasis on global history. So I was fascinated by the fact that now there's going to be like a one book that is going to make my life easier. Because I mean, I agree with you. The fact that it's quite hard to find the right material for an undergrad course in this topic, in the sense that you want something that keeps some cohesion, but it's digestible for undergrads, and I think you do a great job with that. But to give some context to the audience, what are those explanations that you summarize in the book? What are those large explanations on why the world became rich?
So I guess I can start. So after an introductory chapter, the first half of the book, we have we set 5 chapters that we organized, and we kind of went back and forth a little bit on this when we are thinking about it. Some were obvious, some were less obvious, into what are the primary kind of sets of explanations. So the first one we go over is geography, which incorporates a lot. It's climate, it's soil, it's temperature. It's things that the things that we think of as geography, but there's been a wide array of different explanations that are geography based, but also often interact with other things. So sometimes it's just geography, it's how close you are to the equator, or something like that. Other times, and we go over this a little later in the book as well, it might be how geography affected institutions, things like that. Then the next chapter is about institutions. This has been, so Mark was talking about, say, the works of like Douglas North. He's was kind of the the person who brought back institutions into economics and economic history. It was something that was big in the late 19th and early 20th century, but was something that was largely put to the side. Now it's one of the, I think, primary ways that people study economic history beyond the cliometric revolution that Mark discussed. And when we talk about institutions, we might be talking about political, legal, even social institutions, things like this that are, the famous quote by North is that's the rules of the game, that it sets up, the incentives by which we interact with each other. And we go through a long list of, we try to organize it. Of course, it's not just this is not one of these books where we're just every paragraph is just a short summary of papers. You could do that by yourself by reading abstracts. What we really try to do is bring them together and think about how they fit into a broader explanation. We then have a chapter on culture, which is also something that was popular in, say, the early 20th and certainly before the late 19th century, as far as an explanation for why parts of Europe were succeeding. But the recent literature is very different than that literature. So that old literature was very Eurocentric, probably at best, racist at worst. It was like seeking aspects of European culture that made it better, or whatever the explanation was trying to be. Whereas now we kind of look at so the pendulum swung pretty far against those type of explanations, and I think again for good reason. They were grounded in not so yeah grounded in bad things, let's put it that way. But the pendulum might have swung too far in that we shouldn't necessarily think that culture plays no role. So the recent literature kind of follows in the works of cultural anthropologists like Boyd and Richardson, who were kind of the real kind of leaders in the 80s and 90s in terms of bringing cultural anthropology back into something that became big and cross-disciplinary. And then recently, some of your listeners might know about Joe Henrich, who's had a couple of really good books and really accessible books in the last few years that links kind of these cultural ideas to economic ideas. And that's where that literature has largely gone. And so what we try to do is link is again, it's kind of summarize, but also organize all of these different cultural explanations into why certain parts of the world have become rich. But also, and I guess another thing we should say here too is that it's not just why certain parts of the world have become rich, but it's why others either caught up, took a while to catch up, or still haven't caught up. All of that is part of what we're trying to do here. And then we have two more sets of explanations. One is demographic, which is probably, arguably the oldest in the social sciences. Goes back to Malthus and the famous Malthusian theory that the lot of humanity was mostly going to be right around subsistence, because even when you had a one-off advance, whether it be technological, organizational, or some type of massive death event like a plague, eventually you'd have more children, and those children would eat up all the surplus. But there's been some pretty good work recently that suggests that Malthus might have been right, and we can use the Malthusian logic to think through the pre-industrial world. But how does this change when you have a shift in birth and death rates? And then the final one we look at is colonization. There's been a lot of work done, especially kind of on the role that colonization played, especially on the colonies. This largely follows, in the last couple of decades at least, on the work of Acemoglu Robinson, Acemoglu Johnson Robinson, who look at the colonial legacy and the role that it played on institutional development of the colonies. We also, in that part at least, briefly discuss the role that colonization played in Europe, in terms of potentially benefiting Europe. There's a big controversy right now, mainly between historians, well, among historians, but also between historians and economic historians, on just how salient that was. And we briefly hit on that in this chapter. So that's the first half. And if Mark wants to either discuss more or...
I would like to go a bit into the details of some of the things that you mentioned, because when you refer to culture and institutions, um, I'm wondering, how do you draw the lines between these two? That's something that I personally struggle with when I'm designing my course, which is, it makes some sense to argue that those are two different things, and maybe the fields have evolved separately. But at some point, they seem quite similar, right? The rules of the game, if they're not formal, could be interpreted as cultural features. And you're probably the ideal people to talk about this, because you guys work on this. You guys work on religion and institutional features behind that, but it's usually understood religion as culture. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that. I don't know if you want to start with that, Mark, but I also want to know what you think about this, Jared.
Okay, so a lot to get into. So the topic of culture and institutions, I think, has been a really growing one. It's really it's been an area of a lot of research in the last 10 years. So, and it's a thorny issue for following reasons. So Douglas North gave a definition of institutions as the rules of a game, where he included formal institutions, things like the legal system you have, or the property rights system you have, or whether you have elections, or if you have a democracy or an autocracy. Those are formal institutions, right? They correspond to laws and written things. But he also, in the same books, like his 1990 book on and his earlier work as well, he also acknowledged those aren't the only types of institutions that matter. So then he talked about something called informal institutions. And so what are informal institutions? Well, informal institutions are things like norms, social norms. They govern how the formal laws or institutions are enforced. But the problem with informal institutions, I think, is that they don't necessarily behave in quite the same way as formal institutions. We can definitely acknowledge that taxonomy can work, but the same tools that you need to study the formal institutions might be different for informal. We know from a lot of work that social norms change slowly, or they could be very stable for a long time. Then they can drastically change. There could be flipping points and so on, and so they might behave differently. And so I think a lot of work in the last 10, 15 years has been to kind of look at this in a more but in a kind of more theoretically rigorous way, even also a more empirically rigorous way, to try and disentangle when is it culture, when is it institutions, and to see if culture plays an independent role. And I think the papers that we look at in our culture chapter, and the kind of relatively well known papers, such as the paper by Alessina, Juliana Nunn on the plough agriculture. That paper says that societies with a long history of plough agriculture tend to have developed norms whereby the women stay at home and the men work in the fields, and these norms persist over time, and so that even second generation children of immigrants in the United States are shaped by them. That seems to say, look, in the modern United States, institutions are held the same regardless of whether you're descended from plow-using people or not plow-using people. But to the extent that your behaviour is different, that could reflect the role of culture. So I think a lot of the work in what's sometimes called persistence analysis has been trying to study and identify that those forces. So we try our best to kind of discuss this and discuss how it is integrated into kind of the frontier knowledge that we have as economic historians, or at least when we're talking to our students or to other people. I think the current frontier research or debates amongst researchers has pushed that debate one level further. And it's not just about cultural persistence, but it's often about how do you get moments of cultural change. So that's one of the ongoing puzzles in the culture literature that I'm aware of, which is that sometimes culture is very persistent. So you have these papers arguing that things like anti-Semitic preferences or gender norms persist, or norms about cooperation and trust persist for centuries. But then you have other issues where it seems like social norms have changed just in a generation or less. So the famous examples are things like gay marriage, where at least publicly disclosed attitudes towards gay marriage or have changed quickly, or you have the cultural revolutions, or sorry, the sexual revolutions of the 60s, which also seen rapid a rapid shift in cultural values. And so I think understanding when is culture sticky, when is it fast moving, is one area of research which is kind of alive. And then the other one, which you alluded to, is the interaction between culture and institutions. So, like we know that in Latin America in the 19th century, the formal constitutions and institutional arrangements were quite similar to the United States, right? But we also know that political and economic outcomes are quite different than in the United States. And so why was that? I mean, we could have an argument or discussion about, is that due to deep cultural differences, or is it to do with differences in the de facto allocation of political and economic resources or different economic structures? So there's a lot of, I think, fascinating material on this topic, and I think our book does provide a very good way in to a lot of these topics for people, or a good one source kind of stopping point, resting point, or source book for thinking about, what shall I read or what papers are relevant on these topics.
I want to hear your opinion on this also, Jared, but like let me bring some like additional element to the question, right? Because what you do in is fundamentally providing an articulated view of this literature, which is a literature that has evolved in a rather isolated way. And by that, I mean that pretty much everyone has pushed for their own theory, right? So, in my opinion, the field has evolved with a certain drive for unique causality, if you want. And your book and some other efforts could probably agree on the fact that growth is a multi-causal phenomenon, right? So I would like to hear your opinion on how do you think that, or how positive is it for the discipline to be pushed a bit in that direction of individual or like independent agendas that are competing more than cooperating, and how do you think that the incentives of the discipline are designed for a better type of outcome? I don't know, I want to hear your thoughts on this, as precisely the people that are trying to say like, hey, there are all these explanations and maybe there are things in common among them.
Yeah.
Would you like to start with that, Jared?
Yeah, no, it's a really really good question, and it's actually one of the things that I think was motivating this book, because what and I think, to be clear, and Mark can correct me if I'm saying something about his own work that doesn't agree with, but I think with both of us, we do this too, right? In that this is what the incentives of the profession are, and like in our own academic work, not in this book, especially papers. Papers in academia, or at least, are meant to be somewhat concise, make one point. And I think when it comes to this, it does matter what the question is, of course. Most papers, something of 30 pages, double spaced, something like that, you're not going to be able to answer questions as big as the ones that we pose in this book. And I think there is a certain utility to doing that, to making, to being able to make some type of claim and make it a fairly robust claim that X, at least, maybe is causally related to Y, or something like that, that we can get some type of knowledge on. Now, the problem, Javier, is you're bringing up here, and I think it's a very good one, and which is one of the reasons that we wrote this book, is that when you do that, yeah, I mean, every paper has a section that where it relates to the other literature, but for the most part, I don't think these papers, most papers, and I would even include my own in there, just because of the limitations of writing a paper. You don't really deeply engage with how your work interacts with a whole host of other works that are getting at similar outcomes, maybe not the exact same outcome, depending on what you're writing about. And then when we're thinking about the very big picture, how and why economic development, or really in economic growth, happened in certain parts of the world and not others. I mean, I think, of course, you're right that this is not a monocausal event. This is what this book is about, and this is what we try to say. So look, there are all these competing explanations. Some are, all of them have elements of truth in them, and all, now how you weight them might be, different scholars are definitely going to disagree on how heavily some of these should be weighted. But one thing that most of these works do not do, and and again, especially when it's articles and not so much books, I think it's for good reason, is consider how the various theories interact with each other. And in some cases, one thing we really emphasize is the interaction between institutions and culture. We know what Mark was just talking about, how these two things are often inseparable, but they often also complement each other in ways that, if you just look at one aspect, especially if you're looking at, say, formal institutions, without a consideration of the cultural elements, be they norms, or things like that that really undergird the institutions, you really can't understand how institutions work. Mark brought up the idea of similar kind of political arrangements in, say, Latin America. You could also make the case that this was one reason why the quote unquote exportation of democracy to say Iraq or something like that didn't really work. Or in the Middle East more generally, is there are norms associated with such institutions that are really important for them to make them work. And this is when we think about then going to the really big picture. We discuss this in the context of the book of industrialization and the growth that happened after industrialization. There was a lot of uh, institutional development that happened, but there were also cultural developments that had been happening previously that really contributed to this. And there's even interactions with geography, how geography affected. We mainly focus on institutions, but certainly you could make the case for culture as well. And yeah, so I mean, I think if you want my opinion on the field on this, I think there are benefits to having papers that really narrowly focus on one thing and really do it well, because that's hard, and you can't really do that well and do it in a very convincing way in a short enough thing that would be worthwhile of a journal article. I mean, you might be able to do it in a book where you kind of consider all these avenues, and that's what we tried to do here. But to really narrowly focus it, I think it's okay to have uh, one argument, as long as when you're reading it, or when it's being taught or something like that, it's put into a broader context. That is hard to do, and that's, I mean, frankly, one of the openings that we saw in a book like this is that there was nothing like that. Yeah, so I mean, again, so I think it's fine that it's done elsewhere, but I'm kind of glad, and hopefully others agree with this, that that some type of contextualization is needed and that our book provides it.
I think that, I mean, what you point out is something that I feel is regularly forgotten in our job, which is that, I mean, there's a certain role of the community, right? So there's some division of labor that it's necessary, and I feel that what you're doing is providing that, right? So maybe it's great that we have this very well done articles on one specific story. We don't need 100 books about all the connections between them, but we need a few, and I guess probably that's what you're doing, and that's very useful. But also in that, I guess in the direction of those intentions, I would like to hear about how you deal with the challenge of the timing of the arrival of modernity or the arrival of modern economic growth, which is a big part of what this literature looks like, right? So a good number of papers are about when you really have the arrival of modern economic growth, right? And although your book is called How the World Became Rich, it could have been called probably When and Why, right? Separating those questions is it's pretty difficult. So I would like to hear how you manage that challenge, and maybe Mark, you could give us some insight. Did you have that conversation, for instance? Like, did you have a conversation like, well, how are we going to prioritize the timing part of the question or the causal part of it, or
We decided relatively early on to mostly to have the first part of a book be thematic, and the second part of a book take a more focused and chronological look. I think that was first and foremost, and I think we both um, broadly, we wanted to present a book which the majority of scholars working in this field, they might not agree with every single word we're saying, they might disagree with some bits of emphasis, but no one's going to just throw this book down and say, how dare you say this? How dare you say my particular theory is wrong or bullshit, right? So we didn't want to write that type of polemical book. Those bonds are available on the market, and we didn't want to take a very controversial, strong stance on something that we ourselves have not necessarily, done original work on. So when it comes to the timing, the conventional view is to say it's the Industrial Revolution, right? And then, so I think both me and Jared were comfortable with that going in. And then the thread of more recent research by scholars working on, reconstructing GDP data and so on suggests that, yeah, it's the industrial revolution, but um, the uptick in growth seems to begin a bit earlier than people used to think. So the textbook Industrial Revolution is like a revolution in 1770 or something, and all the more recent work has both pushed that the date at which the British economy starts to look a little different, more commercialized, more urbanized, more market orientated, more innovative, pushing it pushes that to the 17th century. Really, a lot of work does. At the same time, the work done by Crafts and Harley now more than 30, 40 years ago already suggested that the Industrial Revolution um, wasn't as dramatic a break as we sometimes think in terms of measured GDP growth. So it saw growth increase and it saw sustained growth, but actually the rates of growth were quite slow by modern standards. It wasn't like Industrial Revolution was growing as fast as China in the late 20th, early 21st century. So I think we followed both the conventional view to say, the Industrial Revolution is the breakpoint, and then we followed what I think the frontier work of the last 20 years has suggested, which is to emphasize a little bit more of a continuity between the developments in the 17th century and the 19th century. So smoothing out that rise. So that's my. I think that's the stance we took on the Industrial Revolution, and I think that's the right one to take. We do mention briefly, although we could have done more on this, but we didn't mention briefly that there do seem to be periods in history where growth could have burst through earlier. So, scholars on Sung China have argued that, on things like iron production, Sung China was very impressive in the 11th century. Baghdad was the largest city in the world, probably at some point in the 9th or 10th century. And so the Middle East was more developed than Europe at that point. The Italian city states, particularly on the recent um, Madison Project data set estimates, the Italian city states during the Renaissance were very prosperous by pre-modern standards, as was the Dutch Republic. You could going further back, the most recent work suggests that classical Greece, Athens in particular, were growing economies. They did have experienced some economic growth. So you could choose other episodes of where growth occurred, but none of those episodes achieved what we call modern or sustained economic growth in the sense that they were reversed within a century or so of when they took place. So they petered out, and after a couple of centuries, people in those places were poorer or no better off on average than they had been when these growth effervescences started. So that's our position on timing, I think.
Let me follow like one of the things that you mentioned regarding the singularity of modern economic growth, and this is a bit related to your intention to reach a large audience. And what I'm thinking about is that I think everyone in the field, and probably more generally in economics as a discipline, would agree that the world is improving since the Industrial Revolution, right? Like living standards have improved as in no other period in history in terms of the orders of magnitude and the continuity of that improvement, right? However, in recent years, there's the expansion of this idea and the public opinion that things are going wrong, right? And there's a general pessimism and a push against these narratives that people perceive as simplistic, like progress, like driven ideologies, right? And I faced with that problem. I interact actively in the like public opinion discussions in Latin America, for instance, and you perceive that people think that the world is going wrong and that economies are not perceiving some things that are important. And it's hard to deal with that. And what I would like to ask you is first, if you, I have the impression that you had that in mind in your introduction. You tried to be subtle, arguing that not the entire world is reach, and you seem to try to convey the fact that this is not a simplistic story of well-being and so on. But how do you approach that issue? And not just, I don't want to, I mean, I want to know how do you thought about that while writing the book, but also how do you deal with that when teaching, right? Like, I'm sure that your students have those concerns, and how do you convey the idea that in the long term there are these big forces that have made the world better, and probably they're dysfunctional at some level, um, but how that seems to shock with like the opinion of and the intuition that many people have. How do you navigate those challenges? Do you have any thoughts on this, Jared?
Yeah, no, we do. And, we certainly meant the title of the book to be provocative, How the World Became Rich. I think, I think it rolls off the tongue decently, decently enough. But yeah, we certainly realize, and we're not fools. We realize the entire world is not actually rich. And yeah, I think there's a few things here in your question. I think first is that there are serious challenges that the world is facing and has been facing for a while. I mean, for me at least, first and foremost is climate change, and this is something that is directly related to economic development. But as we note in the book too, the economic development is also one way to address climate change, especially technological development that's associated with economic development. This is something that has the potential to be catastrophic for humanity. Of course, another obvious thing we're dealing with now is the threat of some type of nuclear warfare, something like this, that is also, to some degree, the result of economic development. Where you get the science associated with it. These are things that are not we don't take lightly, and we completely realize that there are downsides, and potentially extremely catastrophic downsides to economic development. Again, though, I think one thing we note a few times in the book, especially in the introductory and concluding chapters, is that economic development is one way to address many of these concerns. I think secondly is that it often seems like the world is not in fact becoming richer. There are massive inequalities, especially in the wealthy world, that I think should be addressed. That we're not discussing. We're not making. This book is not really making claims one way or the other, and we're also not making claims on the should. This is very much a work of, a positive, not a normative book. We're not saying anything about whether even though we clearly have opinions, and I think they probably come through in the book on whether this is a good thing or not. But one thing that is indisputable is that in the past 100 years, and really in the past half century, billions of people have been lifted out of poverty. The fraction of people living on next to subsistence wages is around say 10% of the world's population now. Now that's way too high of a portion. Of course we'd love for that to be zero, but historically, and even if you don't even have to go back that far, it's not even at the onset of modern economic growth, say late 17th, late 18th, early 19th century. 90+% of the world's population was at that level. Now we're down to 10%. It's a massive achievement. And we've actually seen massive achievements in our lifetime. A lot of it coming from China, but other parts of the world as well. This is, I think, something that absolutely should be celebrated. And it's also something that I think one of the key things about this book, and one of the takeaways, especially maybe from a more policy perspective, is that yes, it's clearly important that we understand what happened in history, because one thing we try to do, even in one of the chapters towards the end, is think about what are some of the preconditions that England seemed to have, and even to some extent some of the other follower countries, or countries that were like the Dutch, had many of these preconditions at the time. We say, all right, that's good to know. That's good to know that this combination of conditions can lead to that initial spurt of growth. Now, there's two things about that. One is that those conditions aren't going to work the same in all locations. This is what we were talking about before. When cultures are different, they interact with institutions differently. So it's not like you can just transplant those preconditions into another place and expect it to work. That's fine. It's still useful to know what happened. I think the second thing that in the latter, especially the last two chapters we go through, is that you know we try to understand what happened to England or Britain originally, because that's where modern growth took off. But what eventually ended up happening is countries did not need to reinvent the wheel. They didn't need to go through an industrial revolution from scratch. They could borrow, and this is in fact where most of the growth in the 20th and even in the 21st century has really happened. Is countries have become rich or really moved away from poverty by borrowing. And when we talk about this, we're talking about something like if a country has, say, $10,000 per capita GDP, that's not wealthy by the way we think about it. If you made $10,000 in the United States, you would be well below the poverty line. But my God, I mean, compared to the history of the world, that somebody making 10,000, a family making $10,000 a year. Again, we're not advocating that this is what everybody should be making, but what we are saying is that there are at least a minimal amount of comforts that come along with that most people in world history have not had. And this is something, and we're not the first to say this by any means. There's been a few books recently, like Steven Pinker's book comes to mind, that uses similar data to at least make these claims. Now he's arguing for something very different, I think, than we are. But the point still is that the world has largely become rich, and there's still a long way to go. And understanding how this happened is at least is something that is not going to be a cure or a panacea for the rest of the world's poverty. If it were, we would have done it a long time ago. But it's definitely something we need to get on the right path of knowing.
How so? Now that you bring up this, I guess like broad objective of the research process, which is to like actually enlighten the world with like a complex fact in a simple manner. How do you think that thinking about this book and writing your book has changed your teaching strategy, your teaching methods, right? Because that's probably the most tangible way in which you're actually impacting the community, in the sense of transmitting this complex ideas in a simple way, right? And we've talked about how much of this has been intended to be used as an undergrad course. And I want to bring something that you mentioned, and I found very interesting when you were describing your stories, which is that all of you made reference to a mentor that was fundamental in who you ended up becoming, right? So you talk about Avner, you talk about Bob, both of which actually have had the great opportunity of being a colleague of them. They seem to have been very important. How much do you think about that? How much did you think about that when you were writing the book, when you're teaching, that maybe there's a whole generation of people that are going to be talking about Mark and Jared in 20 years in a podcast? How do you deal with that sense of responsibility? I don't know. Tell me a bit about that. I'm curious to hear the opinion of both of you on
Uh,
that. Maybe Mark, you want to start?
I'll answer that briefly. So, all those questions were very stimulating. But I actually wanted to also answer your previous question about this, the lack of growth. But I was just saying to start with, I'm I, I don't I don't think I had any direct mentors. I think the people who influenced me indirectly, and so I would just say that I actually find the books I read the real. I mean, so I met Avner Gray for the conference once, and he was very kind, and he gave me very good, extremely good comments on my paper. But actually, like I got indirectly, I was influenced by him by reading his 2006 book, right? Ditto, I very briefly met Doug North once, but I didn't really get, I didn't even introduce myself. I guess said hi to him, but he influenced me with his books. So I think that was more influential than any or it could be indirect. Like you could be in a lecture room and you see someone lecture and they inspire you by their lecture, but they never know who what your name is. It's possible as well. So yeah, I would just say Tyler Cowen writes a lot about mentors, and he thinks it's very important to get mentors, and I think that's right. But I don't think you should overweight what you will get from a one-to-one interaction necessarily in relative to learning by some other means. So I learned a lot from people. I think when I was younger, but one of the reasons I think I have a slightly eclectic skill set and set of interests was that I was quite early on really kind of into using like reading blogs and listening to podcasts before they were as popular as they are now, and so I was accessing a lot of information and knowledge which wasn't on the courses when I was a student. So we weren't being taught, that much about institutions when I was undergrad or grad student, but I was able to uh, find out that stuff through my own research. So that's how I think about that. But that's a side point, I guess. I wanted to answer the question about growth and inequality and where we're going forward. So I think we definitely have entered into an era where economic growth looks like the path of future growth looks less favourable than I think at any time since I've been following these things. Worse even than after 2009, where definitely it was a big blip. But I think it's really bad, and that's so the reason for pessimism is not that economic growth isn't great and isn't all it's cracked up to be. The reasons for pessimism are solely due to the fact that economic growth has been too slow, basically. And so if you look at the United Kingdom, so I'm originally from the UK, the United Kingdom was kind of converging almost to US living standards up until 2009. But since 2009, its growth rate has just fallen below that of its peer countries in the in the rich world. And is that fine? Like, if you're one of these degrowthers or one of these people who emphasize kind of other stuff apart from economic growth, you might say, "Oh, that's fine. The UK is a rich country by global standards. What? How does it matter if it's growing half a percentage point less a year than it was previously?" But if you look at British politics or what's happening to young people, you see it's actually catastrophic. Lower growth rates mean less opportunity. They mean less resources to invest in the future. They mean people are now suffering from a cost of living crisis. They can't afford their energy bills, which are now spiking. It means students can't pay back their student loans. So if growth slows, the world becomes more zero sum and less positive sum. And as it becomes more zero sum, more conflict becomes likely, and the conflict becomes nastier. So I think the story of economic growth is kind of almost the most important thing we could write about. And I think it's more that's partly why we wrote this book, and it's also why I think development economists and economic historians really should focus on growth as opposed to saying just policy evaluation. Right? Thinking about transformative episodes of growth is vital. Something that Larry Pritchett has argued for. Okay, so maybe I'll try and relate that to your final point, which is how I teach. Um, my students at George Mason have actually, and I think they're different than in many other US universities because a lot of them are they're from fairly diverse backgrounds. Many of them are immigrants or children of immigrants, so they actually don't seem to need any convincing that growth is really important. Uh, so they buy this story off the bat. They don't question, they don't disagree with me on that. So I don't have to convey them. They're not actually as interested in the types of topics you read about Ivy League students being passionate about. But I've not yet taught this book. This summer, I've got an online course on economic development, and so it's the first time this book has been assigned for that. And we'll see how they use it. But I'm only using the book as a subset of a course, but as part of a background on historical institutions, because a lot of the course is actually going to be about kind of modern topics in development economics. It's not an economic history course.
Great, Jerry. Would you like to
Yeah, sure.
answer this
Yeah,
question?
yeah. That class sounds pretty awesome, Mark. Yeah, no, I think the biggest thing I'd say is, and I would say that at least I can only speak for myself in this. I didn't go into this book with this motivation, but as we were writing it, and it, frankly, yeah, I think it's something that we're both pretty proud of how it came out, and I think, yeah, especially how accessible it is, how, I do think, for an academic tome, it's pretty well written, which you can't always say about academic works. That as we were writing it, I realized that this very much could be the type of book that somebody picks up, especially if they're assigned it, and maybe as an undergrad, or maybe just, an interested high school student, or somebody like that, that picks it up, sees it, and then realizes this is what they want to do with their life. And if that just happens with, say, one person, that would be amazing. I mean, and I think that that's one of the reasons that, we often get into this field in the beginning, or, get into this, is to inspire people to think about these types of issues that we find to be really important. And I do think that what we've done with this book is at least given ourselves the opportunity to, that where that might happen with a book like this. And so, yes, absolutely, I think that that's one of the, that actually, I think, might end up being, and probably will be, end up being, if that in fact happens, the most important thing that comes out of this book is that, people will especially pick it up early, before they've really decided a career path, or especially maybe even before they've decided to go to graduate school or something like that, and really just want to do this with their lives, really want to understand some of the issues. Because one thing that comes out of our book too is that while we say a lot of what the research has done, there are still a lot of open questions there. And there's open questions that are, we don't even know are open yet. For instance, so with stuff that will happen over, say, the next decade or so, that I think a lot of the research that's been done on, say, Western Europe, or, increasingly in China, um, will help inform. And so, yes, I mean, I think that if there's one thing that would be the most satisfying from this book, it would be that. And like Mark, we haven't really taught out of the book yet. I will this coming up year, but in a sense, it's kind of builds on stuff we've been, at least myself, and I think Mark too, have been teaching. Just we haven't had this type of book to really teach out of. I've taught mainly out of a variety of articles, for instance, that, almost, I think, maybe all of which we cite in this book, that I have to bring together for a class, that in a way that it's mainly, then it's about a lecture, me telling the class, well, this is how X relates to Y, how we should be thinking about the pathway that growth happened in a certain context. And, one thing the book does is it does that all in a very succinct way that also allows us to get to other things too. So in a class like I teach a European history class that does, or European economic history class that does this. But I'd love to, at least in a class like that, talk a little more about China. Say, even though it's obviously not part of Europe, when we think about comparative economic growth, that has a lot of implications for how we think about European economic history. Um, it's really hard to do that when you're just teaching out of articles, because you're already behind the eight ball by having to do so much with just getting the Europe stuff down. I think what this book does is it presents so much information in such a way that students don't have to read, 30 articles to get the information you want them to understand, to understand what the big issues are. And because once you do that, I mean, you lose the students. There's only so much that the brain can intake, and, it's one class out of five they're taking or something at the time. um, so, yeah, and I think because of that, hopefully this will be something that, to the extent that undergraduates enjoy the book, and, we certainly hope they do. We certainly wrote it so that it would be about, as I hopefully others view it this way, and as enjoyable as this material is, can be, that it's something that they really do kind of start to internalize, and hopefully inspires them. I think that's really important.
Let me ask you one final question, which I asked all my guests, which is why writing a book. So this goes back to just what you were talking about, Jared. But I know you've written previous books before, and I would like what to hear your opinion on the broader issue, right? How our discipline our discipline's incentives are probably aligned for people to write more and discuss more articles. And in that context, why it might be important or under which circumstances writing a book makes sense. I would like to hear the opinion of both of you on this. Maybe Mark, you might want to start with
Great.
this.
Yeah. Sure. So this goes back to one of your earlier questions, actually, which I was going to jump in on, which is that most articles these days are really influenced by this policy evaluation, causal effects literature. So basically, what we're interested in when we read those papers is does a particular intervention or treatment, it could be historic, it could be contemporary, have an statistically significant and economically meaningful effect on an outcome we care about, like GDP growth or incomes or whatever. Um, and so if you can show that there's that such an effect and it's robust and it's causal, right, it's well identified, it's a real effect, it's not just a haphazard correlation, then basically you can publish the paper, right? But then as students or as people interested in the topic, like how the world grew rich, what we're really interested in is like, not does this one policy have a positive effect in this particular setting. What we're interested in is, in some sense, closer to VR squared. We're interested in how much of the differences in growth, how much of the variation we observe in incomes across the world or in growth rates, how much of that could be explained by different policies or institutions or different factors. And so I think, yeah, the if we just it's valuable to accumulate knowledge about causal effects, right? That's important. That's genuine knowledge we can add to the tree of knowledge, but without any attempt to um, put this all together and try and tell a bigger story, then it's a little bit limiting and frustrating, both I think for students taking a course where they're just reading papers, and even I think for the profession. So I think that books are more important, and traditionally in economic history, they were seen as important. So the big players in economic history, I think, up until the generation above older than me and Jared, did write books. So we mentioned some of his names already: Bob Allen, Abner Grife, Greg Clark wrote a very influential book, 2007 book, and so it was a book, economic history, uniquely in economics. Post World War II economics was a book discipline, somewhat of a book discipline. Um, and at that, when that was happening in, say, the 1990s and early 2000s, the top economic historians didn't publish in the top economics journals that often, actually. They did occasionally, but they were more likely to publish these books. And I think what we've seen in the last 15 years is the top economic historians have featured very heavily in the top econ journals. They've written great papers and published those papers, but they haven't actually yet written books in many cases. And so there is a gap in the market for something which is synthesizing the literature and something which is trying to tell a bigger story. And I mean, I don't think this is a final book we'll write. It's not either of our final words on the topic of economic growth, but I think it is definitely filling that market niche of tying together a very important body of research, which has emerged in the last 20, 25, 30 years.
Yeah, no, and I think, yeah, I agree with everything Mark said, and I think to just a couple things to add is, one, as you mentioned, we both have written books prior to this. The books that, and separately, the books that we had written are different from this book in that both my book and Mark's book with Noel Johnson were meant to make a direct and in wide scale, kind of wide scope rather, academic contribution. Not to say that, and to be clear, the current book we're talking about now, How the World Became Rich, we do view as certainly an academic contribution, just a different type. Now, I think a reason to write a book like the type we wrote prior was is really twofold. Sometimes there are some arguments that just take much more than the standard 30, even 40 pages. Another thing is that there are some aspects of an argument to really make an argument complete that are not really publishable in the sense of it requires maybe a lot of historical background, which in the economics profession is is always going to be limited when talking about journal articles. or really kind of maybe big case study evidence or things like this that really when all brought together make for a really convincing argument, but individually not so much. Now, this book is different in that the first half of it is not, in a sense, original research in that we're bringing together different articles. Now, it's original in the sense that we were able to kind of organize it and bring it together in a way that even I think in many cases maybe the authors hadn't themselves had considered. And I do think that that's incredibly valuable. Now, within economics, there are places like the Journal of Economic Literature, for instance, which bring together longer papers that do similar things. But one thing that I think is also really important about the current book that we do is then in the last half of the book, it's not just about bringing together this literature. It's then about, all right, so what do these insights tell us about how the world became rich, not just in Britain, even though obviously we focus quite a bit on Britain, but then how it spread to the rest of the world, and then eventually in the 20th and 21st century spread well outside of Europe and its offshoots. This is something where I do think that it's not, in each case of what we did in this book, none of these chapters without dramatic changes would be individually publishable given the current standards of economics, in that we bring in some data from others, but we're making causal arguments that are based on hundreds of pages of work at this point, not based on some very narrow data set that's pushing one argument. In fact, as Mark was just noting, we do the opposite. We try to bring together theories, which at this point is something, and I think that this, for better or for worse, is not something that the economics profession, or I think this is not just economics at this point. I think this is most of the social sciences, at least from what I've read, does not value in the publication process. This is not to say that economists don't value this. In fact, I hope, and I'm maybe cautiously optimistic that the type of work we've done in this book will be highly valued in the way that bringing together various theories and thinking how they interact with each other is something that is not done as frequently, maybe outside of the Journal of Economic Literature. So and in terms of why a book, then I mean, I think it's the combination of those things. It's both the pages that you need, but it's also the type of arguments that you can really nail once you have those pages that you can't nail in 30 pages. So I think both are valuable. I don't think Mark or I would advocate for the entire profession moving to a book centric profession, say like history is, or something like that. There are disciplines that are book centric, and I think that serves their purpose as well. I think that there's a reason that economics, and I think in many respects a good reason that economics has moved towards more of a journal centric profession. But there's definitely still plenty of space for books, and hopefully the audience will eventually agree if they read our books like this.
I agree. I mean, I think you wrote a great book. I do think that it's a very valuable outcome. So thank you a lot for that. Thanks a lot for being here. This was very interesting. Enjoy a lot reading the book again. I'm going to use it in my course as well. And well, I wish you the best of best luck with the sales of the book, and I would highly recommend it to anyone who is interested in growth from a long-term perspective. Let me say thanks again, and I'll see you guys soon.
Well, thank you so much.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged, thank you, and take care.